sex, for me, didn't start in the 21st century. For me, it started in the 20th century, specifically in the 1980s. I entered the world of sex and sacred sex, the conscious exploration of all forms of sex, at a time when most people were running from sex. It was the middle of the AIDS crisis, or actually the early days of the AIDS crisis. And how I came to this passionate study of sex was accidental. I'm putting air quotes around that for people who are listening to this on tape later, because we know there are no accidents. It came out of desperation, though. It came out of nowhere else to turn. I was in the Broadway theater for most of my adult life, primarily as a general manager and a producer, as well as other things. And in the 1980s, obviously, AIDS being a disease in those days primarily afflicting gay men, in the mid-1980s, I was losing up to 4 colleagues, friends, or family a week. We could not memorialize people fast enough to keep up with the deaths. That wasn't every week, but some weeks, as many as 4. To cope with this, I was told about a group called the New York Healing Circle. The New York Healing Circle was a group that met several times a week, but the big group was on Tuesday in a high school gymnasium on 18th Street, 17th Street. And it was based on the principles of Louise Hay's work, whom I'd been reading and working with You Can Heal Your Life and all of Louise's tapes. I'd been working with those for a few years, and they'd already started to work real magic in my life. And now there was this group, based on her work, coping with AIDS. Yes! So I rocked up there looking for 2 things at first, and a third quickly followed. The first thing I was looking for was some way to cope with all the grief, some way to cope with all the sorrow and all the loss. The second thing I was looking for was an answer to the big question that happens every time a major tragedy happens, which, you know, the questions you ask that are, is there a God, God is all there is? And if there is, how could this be happening to us? Why have they abandoned us? The little questions, right? And I hadn't been at the Healing Circle long, but I realized that I had a new question. And this was the question that changed everything for me. That question was, how can I help my gay brothers have sex safely? Let me tell you why that was a big question. Gay men were the sexual adventurers and pioneers of the 20th century. They were the ones taking sex to its limits. And, you know, admittedly, much of that activity took place physically unsafely due to this new disease. In dance clubs that stayed up all night, people would dance and fuck for days running, on drugs. Perfect petri dish for a mutant virus. But nonetheless, they had discovered places about sex that the rest of us had not been to, not in the 20th century and not in some decades, if not centuries. So now, how are we going to tell these men, oh, you can't do anything you used to do before, and you have to do everything with a condom? I mean, it wasn't going to work. It just wasn't going to work. Nobody, when the fear of the plague was over, on some level, when things had calmed down just a bit, we were going to go back to infecting each other. So how could my gay male friends have ecstatic, mind-blowing, life-changing sex with a condom on? Sex that they wouldn't even notice the condom was there. It was so mind-blowing. Well, I met 2 people at the Healing Circle who also helped change my life, and they were Annie Sprinkle and Joseph Kramer. Some of you may know Annie Sprinkle. She's a former prostitute, now performance artist and healer. And Annie and I and Joe shared the same question we found out at the New York Healing Circle. Joe took more of a Taoist approach. Annie and I were fascinated by Tantra. We looked to the East because there were no answers for us in the West. And we heard that Eastern ways of sex were more about energy and less about genitals. This was a good beginning. If we could get people energetically high, we'd handle the spiritual question, hopefully, and maybe the grief question, but we would certainly begin to handle the how can we get high and transcendental with our sex without infecting anybody. So that's how I came to sacred sex. It was a path of necessity.